Dr. Kathryn Horwitz is a past president of the Endocrine Society. In the mid-1970s, she discovered that breast cancers contain progesterone receptors, a contribution with profound implications for every woman being diagnosed with breast cancer today. Dr. Horwitz is currently Distinguished University Professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. What questions were you asking when you were in Dr. McGuire's lab?
He asked me, he had been working on estrogen receptors in breast cancer. What was evident in those early years is that even though if you take 100 women that had estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, you would have expected, based on theory, that all of them would respond to hormone treatments. But in fact, only about half of them were responding to hormone treatments. So the question was, why is that? Why is the presence of the estrogen receptor not sufficient to make that tumor hormone responsive? And Dr. McGuire had an idea that you needed to measure not only the estrogen receptor, but to find out whether that estrogen receptor was functional, was working properly. And the way to test that was to find a gene that the estrogen receptor controls. And that gene is one of those genes we knew in those days from animal work was the progesterone receptor. So when I came into the lab, he said, "Kate, see if you can figure out how to measure progesterone receptors in a breast cancer." Well, that was tricky because we didn't have the tools then that we had today, the antibodies or anything like that. That was before all of those days. And you had to measure the presence of a receptor with a radioactive hormone. And it took me a couple of years to figure out how to do the assay. And then we started working on human cancers, real human cancers, and found that some of them did have progesterone receptors. And that was, I still remember seeing the data coming off the centrifuge with a progesterone receptor peak coming off.
Wow.
You know, there's nothing like,
Wow, yeah.
like a scientist kind of seeing that raw data, seeing something for the first time. You know, I was the first person in the world ever to see a progesterone receptor in a human breast cancer. And I still remember how I felt.
What was the response in the media or
Yeah, I think the scientific community and the medical community was extremely interested, the oncology community. And the assay for progesterone receptors was very rapidly adopted by for clinical decision-making in oncology. So it was confirmed and adopted very quickly. In fact, Betty Ford, who was the president's wife at the time, she was First Lady, she was diagnosed with breast cancer while she was in the White House. Her doctor somehow found out that I had developed this assay, and they asked us to analyze Mrs. Ford's tumor. And it was probably the very first breast cancer out of the millions that have been done since then that had its progesterone receptor analyzed. Wow. And her tumor progesterone receptor is part of my thesis, my PhD thesis. Yeah. So she gave me permission about a year ago to talk about it.
When you were president of the Endocrine Society, what were the most compelling issues that you were involved with?
Yeah. The society obviously was already doing exceptionally well and is the premier endocrine society in the world. And when I sat down, especially with Scott Hunt, and tried to think about what we could do, where we could lead the society into the future, one of the clear things were financial issues. And Scott and I spent a great deal of time the year I was president traveling around the country, going to some of the big pharmaceutical companies, I forget which ones they were, Pfizer, Genentech, places like that, to ask them to support the society both scientifically as well as financially. And I think many of them came through, and the societies continued to try to bridge the gap between academics and industry since then. So it was an area that I was keenly interested in, and I think the society has broadened those interactions more and more over the years. So, if I think of anything as a legacy, having started that may be one.